you very much.
Apologies.
That's perfectly all right. The recording, Brittany will send a link to you for the recording tomorrow or the day after. Hi, I am Joe Lex. As you can see by all the initials behind my name, I'm retired. For the last few years, I've been a guide at Laurel Hill East and Laurel Hill West, and also do the podcast. And this tour that I'm giving this evening is actually based on 10 people that I've done a podcast about. This is the podcast, All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories. The QR code will take you directly to the site, the Podbean site. There are two podcasts there, All Bones Considered, comes out on the first of the month. It's usually a mix of people from East and West. Like the one that's coming out on Saturday is about the founding of Women's Medical College, Female Medical College. And I have excerpts, I have stories from 1850, from 1870s, from the 1930s. And they're just sort of scattered all over the place. Some of the people are at East, some of the people are at West. Whereas Biographical Bites from Bala is usually about one person or one very specific topic, and that comes out on the 15th. I am pleased to say that there is a book coming out in September that is mini biographies. Some of the scripts that I've done for podcasts, I found a publisher, and it's coming out, like I say, in September. 52 Women of Laurel Hill Cemetery. This is the first of what I hope will be 4 books over the next couple of years, over the next few years. 5 of the women in this book are on today's tour. These are the people I'm going to talk about today. You might recognize some of these names. Most of them, I assume, you will not recognize, and that's perfectly okay. We are going to start with Abraham Lincoln's spiritual advisor, the Reverend Matthew Simpson. He is buried in Ashland. Oh, let me get my pointer options. What do you want? Let's laser pointer, pan, highlighter. Let's do the highlighter. Yellow's good. Yeah, okay. So he's here in the Ashland section. There's the conservatory over there. There's the Poth Mausoleum. Harry Wright is in here. Reverend Matthew Simpson is right across the street from one of the founders of Standard Oil, a guy named William Warner. He didn't have as many shares as John D. Rockefeller, but he still did okay for himself. Matthew Simpson was Abraham Lincoln's Billy Graham. He was destined to be a minister from the time that he was young. He was by the 1839. He was already president of Indiana Asbury College, which is now DePauw University. In 1859, he got moved to Evanston, Illinois, in the Methodist ministry, and he met Abraham Lincoln when he moved to Illinois, and the two of them connected. They really became close friends. Abraham Lincoln, as you probably know, was a godly man, but he was not a religious man. He professed no particular religion, but he did believe in a lot of Christian values. Matthew Simpson, as I say, was sort of his Billy Graham. Matthew Simpson would go out and take a pulse for what was going on in parts of the United States, and then he would come back and he would report to Lincoln. Lincoln could use that information. Lincoln also enjoyed hearing Simpson preach. He would actually sneak into the Methodist Church and sit in back. This is when he was president. He would sneak in on Sundays just to listen to a sermon from the Reverend Simpson. When Lincoln was assassinated, it was Simpson who was with Mary Todd Lincoln and the boys the next day. He was the one who was comforting them. And then he is also the man who gave the funeral address at Lincoln's funeral in Springfield, Illinois on May 4th. You notice it took almost 4 weeks, 3 weeks to get Lincoln back from Washington to Illinois. This was Lincoln's temporary tomb. If you know the story of the Lincoln assassination, you know that he was in this tomb for many years. This is the mausoleum from which his body was almost stolen. This hill is very familiar to me because I was born in Springfield, Illinois, and the first house that we lived in as I was growing up was about 3 blocks from this cemetery. So after a snow, we would come to the Oak Ridge Cemetery, and I would slide down this hill on my sled. The Lincoln Memorial now is up on top. The Lincoln Tube is up on top. Speaking of Lincoln Memorial, though, this is the plan for the original Lincoln Memorial, not what we have right now. That is Lincoln on top. And on this second level, there are two military men, there are two religious men. One of them is Matthew Simpson. There are 10 people who were scheduled to be on this, and they pulled the plug on this design. They said there's no way that Abraham Lincoln would want to be sitting on top looking down at people. So they went with what they have now, but they had already made the statue of Matthew Simpson. Well, they were going to melt it down. They were going to use it for something else. So Robert Todd Lincoln found out about this, and he got in touch with Simpson's wife and said, "Hey, look, they're going to melt this statue down. Do you want it?" And she said, "Yes, of course." She was working on a project then of a home for older Methodist people, and it became a reality in 1865. It's Simpson House. It sits right there on Belmont Avenue. You've driven past this statue of Matthew Simpson. I don't know how many times. I've driven past it hundreds of times, literally, because I've lived in Bala Cynwyd for 40 some years. But this is Simpson House. This is named for Matthew Simpson. It was dedicated in his honor, and his statue stands out front. Also, Simpson College, the college in Indianola, Iowa, was renamed Simpson while he was still alive. And in 1882, he actually gave a commencement address at the college that was named for him. He is interred in this Gothic mausoleum at Laurel Hill West, as I say. That's not his only monument, though. If you go to Washington, D.C., across the street from the Supreme Court building is a Methodist church. And in this church is the Simpson Memorial Chapel. And this is where a lot of people who work at the Supreme Court sneak into religious services. They have services every Wednesday at 12:10 p.m., just after noon. And they usually get a full house, or whenever anybody needs a place just for isolation and relaxation, they might head to the Simpson Chapel. Our second person to talk about is Bascom Johnson. He was a lawyer. He is buried in the Lansdowne section. This is the Summit section. This is the Clothier family plot here, Strawbridge and Clothier. You go across the road and down a little bit, you find Bascom Johnson. Bascom Johnson was a 1900 graduate of Yale. He moved to Philadelphia, and he was working on his law degree from Penn in 1903. He practiced law until 1909 in Philadelphia. That's when he married Sophie, his wife, who has a family plot at Laurel Hill West. So that's why he is buried in Bala Cynwyd, because of his wife. Bascom Johnson was very athletic at Yale. He was on the track and field team. In 1900, there was no official Olympic team. This is the second modern Olympic after the 1896 in Athens. These are what are called the Zany Games. These went on literally for months. Some people did not even know they were competing in the Olympics until they received a medal. It was that messed up. There's a book called The Zany Games that I highly recommend. It tells about all the craziness that went in these 1900 Olympics. There were some of the sports. Firefighting was a sport. Tug of war. Golf. In fact, Frederick Winslow Taylor, who's buried at Laurel Hill West, just missed a medal in golf. There was imagine this, a swimming obstacle course in the Seine River. People would literally have to crawl up the side of boats and go over boats and then swim under other obstacles in the Seine in 1900. I don't know how many people got sick from that. There was pigeon racing on one day and live pigeon shooting on another day. Thankfully, there was women's croquet. Women's croquet might be my favorite. At the finals for women's croquet, there was one paid spectator. Other than that, it was all the other players and the judges. There was one spectator at the women's croquet finals. Believe it or not, we have 6 people at Laurel Hill, 2 at Laurel Hill East and 4 at Laurel Hill West, who participated in the 1900 Olympics. Pole vaulting has been around for a long time. Pole vaulting was actually used initially in Holland, believe it or not. They would keep a stack of poles outside the houses or near the canals where people would cross, and people would literally use these poles to cross the canals. They were also useful in some battles. Some warriors would use a pole vault like this to vault onto their horse or onto their bull. Now, at the 1900 Olympics, there were 11 athletes from 5 nations who were going to compete in the pole vault. Competition was set for the 15th of July. That's a Sunday. America's 3 top vaulters, including Yale's Bascom Johnson, were all deeply religious, and they were Sabbatarians, and there is no way that they were going to compete in a sporting event on the Sabbath. They said, "Can you move it back to Saturday?" What is July 14th in France? It's Bastille Day. No, they're not going to move it back a day. They said, "You can come on Monday and you can compete on Monday and we'll count it." Well, they showed up on Monday, and guess what? They lied. They were not in competition. So these 3 guys who were the best pole vaulters in the world at the time did not compete because the competition was on a Sunday and they were all shut out of medals. It's really a shame. Now, after he got his LLD, he served for 2 years as a law officer with the Federal Indian Bureau, but he found his true calling in 1913. He joined the American Social Hygiene Association. He was essential in leading efforts to control sexually transmitted diseases and eradicate sex workers in Western American cities, including the Barbary Coast Red Light District of San Francisco. As Major Johnson in the military, he became the director of the Sanitary Corps of the National Army. In 1918, he published a very much discussed article called "Eliminating Vice from Camp Cities." You've heard the term camp followers. You know that the term hooker for a sex worker comes from the camp followers who followed General Hooker's troops around in the Civil War. And they just got to be known as hookers. True story. He published this article, "Eliminating Vice from Camp Cities," in the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Sciences. In 1916, the STD rate in the Army was 91 per thousand. Let's see, there were 1.6 million men in the Army. That means there were about 145,000 soldiers incapacitated by sexually transmitted disease at some point during their time in the military. There was no specific treatment for syphilis or gonorrhea or there was no effective, safe, quick treatment for gonorrhea and syphilis at that time. I'm not even sure they knew about chlamydia, to be honest with you. But when somebody had gonorrhea or syphilis, they were essentially taken off duty for 3 or 4 weeks. And this put a huge hole in the working staff of the United States Army. So this was an important thing for them to deal with, how to deal with sexually transmitted diseases. It took so many guys out of action. After his military work, Johnson directed, oh, wait a minute, too far ahead. Early in the 20th century, 1 people in 10 would contract syphilis at some point in their life. 2 to 3 times as many people would contract gonorrhea. So at any given time, about a quarter of the people in the United States had some sort of sexually transmitted disease in the 1920s or 30s. It was a taboo topic because of the stigma associated with it. If you were a woman and you had an STD, it was just assumed you were a prostitute. You were a sex worker. If you were a man with an STD, that means you had visited a sex worker. Because of Johnson and others, the attitudes about STDs changed. And by the late 1930s, federal, state, and local governments appropriated millions of dollars for control of sexually transmitted diseases. About 90% of Americans were now in favor of not only a government bureau to distribute information about venereal disease, but a congressional appropriation of more than $25 million to help control the illnesses. Now, after his work with the military and helping wipe out, or he didn't wipe out venereal disease, but he cut its occurrence way, way down. Next, he worked with the League of Nations in the international sex trafficking business. He was instrumental in closing 130 red light districts in this country, and he conducted vice and venereal disease campaigns in more than 800 communities. What Brittany and I were talking about was, what does a sex worker do when a sex worker can't be a sex worker anymore? If you're putting all these women and men out of business, then what do you have for them to go to? He retired to North Carolina in 1945. He died there in 1954. He left his wife, Sophie Frances Adams Johnson, 2 sons and a daughter. Because Sophie's family was buried here in Bala Cynwyd, that's where he chose to be buried. It's Lansdowne 203. This is, what did I say, Sophie? Yeah, Sophie Frances. This is Sophie Frances. He met her at a track meet. She was an athlete. She was a high jump and standing broad jump competitor. She was director of outdoor sports at Bryn Mawr, and she started the field hockey team there. I'm going to mention the field hockey team again in a few minutes when we get to Katherine McBride. She was very definitely a suffragist. In 1907, 1909, she was secretary and treasurer of the American Field Hockey Association. This next one has too many firsts to list. This is Sadie Tanner Mossel Alexander. Sadie is buried in the West Lawn section. Very simple plot with her husband, Raymond. The podcast I did is actually about both of them. Sadie was a 1915 graduate of Paul Laurence Dunbar High School in Washington, D.C. Her father was Aaron Mossel. In 1888, he was the first African-American graduate of Penn Law. Her uncle was Nathan Francis Mossel. In 1882, he was the first African-American graduate of Penn Med. Her uncle was Henry Ossawa Tanner, who was a very good painter. His work is in the Barnes. His work is in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Sadie was the first African-American woman to earn a PhD in economics in the United States. She got that from Penn. She was close to being the first woman totally get a PhD in the United States in economics. I'm sorry, she was close to being the first African-American woman to get a PhD in anything, but another woman had gotten a PhD a couple of months before Sadie. She was the first to get one in economics. The only job that she could get as a Black woman with a PhD in economics was as an actuary with an African-American insurance company. No white company would touch her. No schools would touch her. Well, she'd gotten together with Raymond Pace Alexander, who had a totally different background. Sadie was very, very much in an upper class, the Black bourgeoisie, whereas Raymond was the grandson of slaves. But he worked his way through law school. He worked his way up to a top position also. He convinced Sadie that she had to go to law school. So she went back to Penn, and she got her law degree from Penn. She was, again, the first African-American woman to get a law degree from Penn. She was co-founder and the guiding light for the Delta Sigma Theta African-American sorority, and she was voted the first honorary president. She worked in the civil rights at both the local and national level. She and Raymond became the power couple, the Black power couple in Philadelphia. They helped integrate Girard College, which one of her uncles, had actually started that process years earlier. Here she is with Martin Luther King. She was on many of the marches, very well known during her time. She was a highly sought after speaker, frequently quoted. Raymond died, and she stayed active, unfortunately, until Alzheimer's started to take her memory, and she faded away and died. She has a very simple stone next to Raymond. In 2018, she got her plaque, I think, before 2018. This tells a little bit about what she did. But in 2018 is when they started the Sadie Collective. This is a national organization for Black women in economics. It now has more than 10,000 members. From her being the first Black woman with a PhD in economics, the club name for her has more than 10,000 members now. That's pretty cool. This is the Penn Alexander School in West Philadelphia. It's associated with the university. And of course, you probably read in the paper, we're still awaiting our first public statue of an African American female in Philadelphia. For a while, it was a toss-up between Sadie and Marian Anderson. This, of course, is Harriet Tubman. This was displayed at City Hall for a couple of weeks as people were deciding, well, whose statue do we really want to sit here? They've decided on Sadie, and the bids are out now. People are coming in with ideas for the statues, but within the next year or two, I think we're going to see a statue of Sadie Tanner Mossel Alexander at City Hall. And she is chapter 9 in the book that's coming out in September. Next is Katherine McBride, another PhD. Katherine McBride is buried not that far from the funeral home here. She is right here. She's buried with her parents. I see 2 questions have come up. Let me finish Katherine, and then we can take the questions, unless there are things that need to be dealt with right now.
It's just me, Dr. Lex.
Oh. Okay.
Sorry.
Okay.
Carry on.
That's all right. Katherine attended the Stevens School. Most of the women in those days went to Agnes Irwin School, or maybe the Shipley sisters or Baldwin. She went to the Stevens School. And then Bryn Mawr, class of 1925, she was 3 years ahead of Katharine Hepburn. Her PhD thesis was brilliant. It was on aphasia. She and Dr. Weisenberg studied all of the stroke patients who were hospitalized in Philadelphia and were left with aphasia, and then compared them with other stroke patients who did not have aphasia. This was brilliant work. This revealed a lot of information about aphasia to practicing physicians and other clinicians. In 1941, she had a lot of academic jobs. She worked her way up the ladder. I'm going to cut that part out. In 1941, you'll notice the date on the newspaper, December 3rd, 1941, 4 days before Pearl Harbor. This young woman, who is 38 years old, was selected as president of Bryn Mawr College, and everybody went crazy. They loved her. She had taught there for years. She had been one of their favorite students. I've got to say, these 2 pictures are the only 2 pictures I have ever seen of Katherine McBride where she is not smiling. She always had a smile on her face. She spent the next 28 years at Bryn Mawr, and she was loved by everybody. She talked to everybody that she saw. She knew everybody's first names, the janitors, the gardeners, everybody. She had lunch with everybody at least once a year. She was exactly what you would want if you were a college president. Even with the spade, digging, breaking ground, she's got that smile on her face. Here she is with the president of Haverford College, another Quaker influenced school like Bryn Mawr. Here she is with Dr. King. She got very much involved with the civil rights movement also. She turned down federal scholarships in the 50s because they came with a condition that anybody who took a scholarship had to give a loyalty oath. She said she did not want her students to have to make that decision, that you have to take an oath before you can get a scholarship to go to school. In 1968, she was a fellow of the American College, or the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And her attitude throughout life, which she'd really tried to pass on to everybody, whenever something was good, whether it was bad, no matter what, her first question was, what can we learn from this? Just a brilliant, brilliant woman. She saw several new buildings popped up during her tenure. She never married. As far as I know, she was not in a Boston marriage with anyone. She's buried with her parents. I'm sorry. There we go. She's buried with her parents right there by the funeral home at Laurel Hill West. And she's just a remarkably accomplished woman. This is the McBride Gateway now at Bryn Mawr College. And Bryn Mawr College has their McBride Scholarship Association. The McBride Scholarship is scholars, women over the age of 24 who are back in college. I belong to a small group of people. We walk every Tuesday morning at 10 o'clock at Laurel Hill West. You're welcome to join us. We're there every Tuesday morning. But one of the women I walk with was a McBride scholar 30 or 40 years ago, and she still says it's one of the things she's most proud of. Katherine is chapter 9 in my book. Okay, so Brittany, there's no questions for me to ask right now, or to answer right now.
Correct. No questions.
Okay, all right. Next up, David Hayes Agnew. Once again, we're back. There's the bell tower there. There's the Poth Mausoleum. There's Matthew Simpson. There is David Hayes Agnew, right there. David Hayes Agnew, his mausoleum, as you can see, not far from the bell tower. He was a University of Pennsylvania surgeon with a signature that you could almost read. Born in Lancaster County in 1818, he studied medicine with his father. Before his 18th birthday in 1836, he was at UPenn Med School. His graduate thesis was on medical science and the responsibility of medical character. He earned his MD in 1838, and he went back to Lancaster County to practice medicine with his father. But he was determined that he was going to become a surgeon. And to be a surgeon, you had to know anatomy. And to know anatomy, you had to do dissections. And to do dissections, you had to become a grave robber. And David Hayes Agnew was indeed a grave robber. He found his cadavers in potter's fields, but he became the best anatomist in the city, which made him the best surgeon in the city also. In 1852, he actually purchased the Philadelphia School of Anatomy and had private dissecting rooms for people who were willing to pay the price to go in and have him teach them. In 1854, he established the Philadelphia School of Operative Surgery, and the same year, he got a job as a surgeon at Blockley. Blockley had 4 different buildings. He was in the hospital, which later became Philadelphia General Hospital. You might have heard of Blockley Almshouse or the Blockley Sanitarium, but that was a whole complex of buildings, including a hospital. He became a lecturer for Professor Henry Hollingworth Smith at UPenn. He finally got into UPenn in 1858. Smith is buried at Laurel Hill East in the I section. Section I should say. There's not a section for eyes. It's the I section. This is, he became a demonstrator in anatomy for Joseph Leidy at Penn University. Joseph Leidy is the guy whose statue greets you when you go to the Academy of Natural Sciences. Joseph Leidy is the last man who knew everything. There's no other way to put it with Joseph Leidy. He knew everything, and there was a lot less to know back in the 1870s, but he knew it all, and he was probably the last man who knew everything. In 1871, Agnew was the first to hold the newly founded John Ray Barton Professorship of Surgery. John Ray Barton is buried at Laurel Hill East in the shrubbery section. Now, while he was in his career in Philadelphia, Agnew performed surgery not only at University Hospital, but at Philadelphia Hospital, Wills Eye Hospital, and the Orthopedic Hospital. During the Civil War, he was a surgeon in charge of Hestonville Hospital. So now he learned how to do gunshot surgery. In addition to standard surgery, he was now doing trauma surgery. He was a consultant surgeon at Mauer Hospital, which is this huge hospital that at first glance you might mistake for something like Eastern State Penitentiary. But there was this huge, huge hospital, Mauer, which was, forgotten where it was. I didn't write it down. In 1881, Charles Guiteau shot President James Garfield. Agnew was summoned. He was the best surgeon in the country. He was probably the best gunshot surgeon in the country. Now, Joseph Lister's antisepsis, the theory of germs, was 1854. This is 27 years later. And doctors are still not washing their hands before they examine the patients and stick their fingers in bullet holes and do dumb things like that. Garfield got infected. Agnew was an exception. Agnew believed in the Lister's theory of antisepsis. Agnew was very careful. He did scrub his hands. Didn't wear gloves. There weren't surgical gloves yet. They didn't come along until Halstead many years later. But it was not Agnew. It was almost certainly not Agnew who gave Garfield his infection. It was probably his family doctor, this guy, Dr. D.W. Bliss, who was destined to be a doctor because the D stands for doctor. So he was actually Dr. W. Bliss before he became Dr. W. Bliss. Some of the other names you might recognize also. Joseph Barnes was the Surgeon General. J.J. Woodward was the Assistant Surgeon General. He did the autopsy on Abraham Lincoln, on John Wilkes Booth. Barnes and Woodward did the autopsy on Lincoln, and then Woodward did the autopsy on John Wilkes Booth. Anyway, Garfield, as you know, died. The other surgeons submitted a bill to Congress, which was downcoded. They did not get the money that they asked for. He continued to publish this book, Principles and Practice of Surgery. It was popular text for medical students. In 1889, he retired at 70 years. The graduating class decided they wanted a portrait of Dr. Agnew to celebrate his retirement. So they went to Thomas Eakins, who was looking for work, and they paid him $750. So what did Eakins do? Eakins said, I want something bigger than that. He took a picture of Agnew's surgery clinic. And you can see there are no gloves. They're still wearing their black suits. They're still wearing their black street clothes. I want to point out something. If you look closely, there is one black student sitting way in the back and nobody sitting next to him. That was fairly typical for Penn. They would take one black student. Sometimes it would take one black student for all 4 years. That one would graduate, and then they'd take another black student for the next 4 years. A lot of medical schools were doing that. So what did Eakins do with this photo? You know darn well what Eakins did with this photo. He turned it into this amazing painting with some of the same features. You can see the guy who's doing the cutting here. That's him right there. Now, he changed the gas passer. This redhead is not the guy who was giving gas over here. But you can see that he has duplicated this photo very well. He did not include the African-American gentleman, but he did include, you're not going to believe this, all of these people are buried at Laurel Hill. We have 6 people from this photo who were buried at Laurel Hill, including William Henry Furness III up here with his head turned sideways. This is Horace Howard Furness's son, who was a physician, obviously. He was also the most heavily tattooed man in the Western Hemisphere, but that's a whole different story. So this, of course, is the famous Agnew Clinic painting, which is now on display at the Philadelphia Museum of Arts. Agnew died about 3 years later. He died in March of 1892. That's his family mausoleum. It's always kept clean. It's got a nice stained glass in it, but it's really nothing out of the ordinary. Just a nice, plain mausoleum, tasteful mausoleum. Next up, we got Alan Calvert, inventing progressive resistance. Alan Calvert is sort of hidden under some trees here in the Everglades section. This is closer to where he is than this one. But who's over? Wilbur Buds. Wilbur Buds is right there. And then Alan Calvert is there. There is the Titanic lady, Charlotte Cardiza. Can't think of her name. Charlotte Cardiza is buried there. So it gives you an idea of where we are in the cemetery. This is Alan Calvert. He is this father of progressive resistance weightlifting. He was a believer in Milo of Croton. Milo of Croton was a 6th century BCE wrestler. Milo was an Olympic champion 6 times. He got strong he started carrying a bull calf on his shoulders when they were both young. As he grew older, and the calf grew older, he kept carrying the calf around him. And every day he would carry this thing that was getting bigger around. And this was the beginning of progressive resistance weight training. Excuse me, I'm getting the hiccups. He used to spend a lot of time reading the Bible. I should say he used to spend a lot of time looking at the Bible, not for inspiration from the scriptures, but he was admiring the bodies on the centurions and all of these people that were used in the pictures in the Bible. And he wanted to look like that. He was the son of a metal worker. He wondered how he could do it. At age 10, he got this copy of How to Get Strong and How to Stay So. And what was recommended at this time was high reps using pulley weights and light dumbbells from 1 pound. You were not supposed to lift more than 1/10 of your body weight, because otherwise what would happen? You would get muscle bound. Now, he joined the West Philadelphia YMCA to train in their gymnasium, and he hit a wall. This is the type of equipment they had with the pulleys and the weights and the pulleys. Do you see any free weights there? There aren't any free weights. He wanted to get bigger. He wanted to get swole. But this is what was supposed to happen if you used 2 weights that were too heavy. You would get, quote unquote, muscle bound. In 1893, actually, he was 18 years old. He went to the Columbian Exposition in Chicago, and he saw the Arnold Schwarzenegger of the 1890s. This is strongman and bodybuilder Eugen Sandow. Eugen Sandow was considered to have one of the most perfect bodies in the world at that time. This was during the heyday of muscular Christianity. Muscular Christianity is a philosophy that's characterized by belief in patriotic duty, discipline, self-sacrifice, manliness, and the moral and physical beauty of athleticism. The best known American practitioner, of course, was Theodore Roosevelt. Calvert decided that there was a market for heavy barbells. Nobody in the United States was making barbells as their sole business. But what's the problem with making barbells that weigh 50 pounds in Philadelphia, and you got a customer who wants to buy one who's in San Diego? The postage was costing more than the weights. So what he came up with is this clever system where you could fill the ends of the bars, these containers, with shot or with pre-measured shot, pre-measured sand, and you could make minimal changes in the weight. So you could bring the weight up by maybe a half a pound a day or a pound a week and gradually increase the weight so you would barely notice the increased resistance. But the point is, this made these things so light that he could ship them across the country. And then people would use their sand or buckshot or rocks or whatever they wanted to put in them to make the weights that they needed for the exercises they were going to do. In 1914, he published his own magazine called Strength. And he wrote all but one article for the bi-monthly magazine. Its circulation went as high as 40,000 at one time. This Milo system became the way to bulk up. Books on weightlifting and bodybuilding, including The Truth About Weightlifting, Super Strength, both of them are still in print. You can actually find a copy of Super Strength online. During the Great War, he had difficulty getting paper for the magazine and metal for the weights. He ended up selling both Milo Barbell Company and Strength Magazine. He was only 44 years old, but he could retire with that. The new owners drove it into the ground. They filed for bankruptcy in 1930. I mean, it was the middle of the Depression, but they filed for bankruptcy in 1935. They had $200,000 in liabilities and 900 unfilled orders for weights. that were on their hands. Bob Hoffman of York, Pennsylvania, bought the business and he bought the publishing rights for Strength. York Barbell is still in business. I was there just a couple of months ago because that's where the Weightlifting Hall of Fame and the Bodybuilding Hall of Fame are located. And it's about 2 miles north of York. I was actually in Gettysburg. Or no, I was in Harrisburg and went down to York to visit this before I left the area. They have a full body cast of Jürgen Sandow there, and I took a picture of it and I couldn't find it, but that's what was supposed to pop up next. I learned about Alan Calvert from my trainer, Frank Shea, a guy that I've been seeing for the last 10 years or so. Frank is, believe it or not, he's a history buff on bodybuilding and weightlifting. He was with me when we went to the museum in York. He collects Milo weights. These are authentic Milo barbells from 1.25 pounds up to 10, not barbells, but barbell weights. These weights are at least 100 years old, and they look as new as if you bought them out of the shop last week. Alan Calvert died. He lived another quarter century in St. David's. He and his wife raised 4 children. His wife hated the fact that he made weights for a living. She just told her friends he was a manufacturer. His obituary, which I'm sure she wrote, made absolutely no mention of weightlifting or bodybuilding or Milo. And the only way I found out about this guy is because, number one, my trainer has a copy of the book that he wrote on strength training. He still uses it. He says it's that good a book, even though it's more than 100 years old. And when I looked it up, sure enough, Alan Calvert was buried at Laurel Hill West. So here he is. Next up, she recorded everything. You know who this is. This is Marion Stokes. Marion Stokes is in the South Lawn section here. When I talked about Raymond Pace and Sadie Alexander, they're over here in the West Lawn section. Here's South Lawn. Jack Jones, the TV announcer, is here. Larry Ferrari, the organ player, is here. And then Marion Stokes is here. She was a West Philadelphia Girls High graduate. She took a job as an archivist with Philadelphia Library. Her first marriage failed quickly. Her second marriage was to Melvin Medlitz, a Jewish scholar who had one vocal cord. He's still alive. He's recorded an album. You can find it on Amazon. It's The Whispering Magid. In other words, the Whispering Jewish Storyteller. This marriage lasted a lot longer. Both of them became communists. They were going to defect to Cuba. They made it as far as Mexico, and they waited in Mexico for their paperwork to clear so they could just make the hop over to Cuba, and their paperwork never came through. So they ended up coming back to the United States. Marion still worked with the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. If you remember, that was Lee Harvey Oswald. There are movies of Lee Harvey Oswald handing out this ephemera, this leaflet for Hands Off of Cuba, join the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. I'm showing this picture. I thought this was interesting. Melvin Medlitz was the only white teacher at the Frederick Douglass School. Yet of all the people there, he was the one who looked most like Frederick Douglass. So this white Jewish guy used to play Frederick Douglass whenever they did a skit on his life. That marriage broke up after a few years. In the meantime, the FBI was all over Marion. As you see, they had different names for her. They had different misspellings. But yeah, she was on the FBI watch list for many, many years. She was fiercely intelligent. She was a political radical. She was a member of the Communist Party. After her second marriage fell apart, she got involved with public access TV. Sunday morning used to be the wasteland on television. This is back in the Fairness Doctrine, which Ronald Reagan wiped out, said that if you had any opinion piece, you had to have an equal and opposite opinion. And all of this stuff got consigned to Sunday morning graveyard, along with Larry Ferrari. Larry Ferrari would play his organ on Sunday morning, and then they have a public service program like this. But she was incredibly good at putting down the white patriarchy. And she co-produced this show with a guy named Robert Stokes. Robert Stokes was a wealthy peace activist during World War II. He actually spent time in jail as a conscientious objector rather than be drafted. He met Marion, and this very white collar, upper crust Chestnut Hill, whose mother was painted by Diego Rivera, fell in love with Marion, and he left his wife and 5 kids in Chestnut Hill, and they got married in New Hope, and they moved into an apartment together. This is the painting of his mother that Diego Rivera did. It's not on display. It's at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, but it's not on display right now. Here is where Marion's story gets really interesting. It's the late 1970s, and she doesn't trust the news. She bought a Betamax, and she started recording. And she decided that she was going to record the news because otherwise you wouldn't really know what was true, because people kept changing things, alternating facts. Eventually, she was recording all of the news, including local, including national, including cable. And at one point, she had as many as 8 machines going at once. And she was accumulating tapes right and left. Not only that, she fell in love with Steve Jobs when he was very young and just starting Apple. She bought Apple at $7 a share, and she told her friends and relatives to do the same. And those who did got very wealthy because she made a ton of money. Not only that, she collected everything that Apple ever made. I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. Marion and Robert lived together for 34 years. He was 87 when he died. They were living at the Barclay at the time. Barclay is on Rittenhouse. It's one of the nicer apartments on Rittenhouse. They ran out of room. She also subscribed to 40 or 50 magazines a month. She would go spend $750 at Barnes and Noble and for books. And the clerks would invariably say something like, "Are you going to read all of those?" And she would just snap at him. She says, "You think because I'm black I can't read?" And just go in and buy $750 worth of books. So they ended up with garages and apartments and houses all over the city. She had something like 7 apartments that were filled with tapes and magazines and books. This is an idea of the book collection. And this is the garage. She bought 2 of everything that Apple ever made. This woman who never sent an email in her life had the best collection of Apple equipment that anybody had ever collected. When she died and this stuff went up for auction, there were collectors around the world salivating for this stuff. She died on December 14th, 2012. Her son, Michael, we saw a picture of him as a little boy, walked around and turned off all the tape machines for the first time in more than 30 years. And do you know what she was watching when she died? Sandy Hook. She died the morning of Sandy Hook, and that's when they turned off all of the news recording machines. There's a story there. There's a moral there. She had somewhere between 30 and 40,000 books. They didn't count them all. Years worth of magazines and newspapers, 70,000 videotapes, about 840,000 hours worth of material. That's 35,000 days. I did the math for you. It would take you 96 years to watch all of these. It weighed 32 tons. It took 4 semi-trailers and cost $16,000. There is a brilliant documentary. It was made in 2019. It's called Recorder. It's free on Vimeo. Recorder, Marion Stokes. It's about a 90-minute documentary about her and her recording. She is buried, as I say, with her beloved John in South Lawn. And she is chapter 13 in my book. Are we doing on time? Okay, 50 minutes. We're going to be okay with this. Here's a man who changed not 1, but 2 sports. If you don't believe me, watch. He is appropriately buried on the side of a steep hill in the river section, not far from the Schuylkill River, or from the Schuylkill Expressway, then the Schuylkill River course over there. But this is Howard Head. Howard Head, oh goodness. Okay, not sure how that happened. Howard Head entered Harvard in 1932. He wanted to be a writer by his like his older sister. His older sister, I've done a podcast on her too, Elizabeth Head Fetter. She wrote under the name of Hannah Lees, a very popular writer in her day. He was a lousy writer, but he took some aptitude tests and he found out that he was very good at three-dimensional spatiality. So he went into engineering and he found out he had a knack for aeronautical engineering, believe it or not. He was also an excellent poker player. He started stashing away his money for a rainy day until he had about $6,000. Well, he was looking for something to do. In 1947, he took up skiing. He was lousy at it. He blamed the equipment. He said, I know I'm better than this, so it's got to be the skis. So he took his years of experience with aerophysics and he used the equipment that was now available, the various metals and plastics that were now available, and he created layered skis. The problem is the first 39 pair that he built broke the first time they were used. He was about to give up. It was the 40th pair that he took to some friends, some ski pros that he'd met through the years, who took him out on the slopes and came back and said, Howard, these are the best skis I have ever used in my life. So word got out, and he started selling these skis out of the trunk of his car at ski resorts as he was setting up a factory. What really broke him was in Innsbruck, the Winter Olympics of 1964, when several of the medalists were wearing Head skis, and suddenly everybody had to have Head skis. They were lighter than wooden skis. They were more expensive, but they were just better skis. In fact, a lot of people say, I don't know if you're old enough to remember it, there was a huge boom in skiing in like the 1970s and 80s. It seemed like everybody was going skiing every weekend. And it's probably because they had skis that they could control well now because of Howard Head. Head, he sold the company. He could have done better. With 1971, he got $16 million for it. He retired at age 57. Head has done okay for itself, as you can see. You can buy. I did one of the tours that I gave 2 years ago now. I was pointing out how Head had spread out, and one of the people on the tour just held up her glove, and it said Head right across it. He was wearing Head ski gloves on this tour. She had no idea that Howard Head was buried at Laurel Hill West, or even who he was. Anyway, Howard Head decided to take up tennis. Guess what? He was lousy at it. And what did he do? He blamed the equipment. He said, this tennis racket is lousy. He saw a pro. He saw a tennis pro. The tennis pro said, if you work really hard with a ball machine, you might get 5% better, but I don't give you a lot of hope. So he got this ball machine from a company called Prince, and it was awful. It was awful. He tore it down, he rebuilt it, and he took it back to the company. He said, here, I fixed your machine. It works right now. And he showed him, and it did. It fired the balls precisely the way it was supposed to. But he got interested because he realized that he was not making the contact that he wanted to with the racket. So he did the aerodynamics, and he discovered that the typical tennis racket did not have a sweet spot. The sweet spot would have been somewhere down here on a typical wooden tennis racket. So he expanded. Nobody had ever done this before. He expanded the racket head until there was a sweet spot right there. And that made all the difference in the world. It is rare to make a change where professionals improve. It's not that hard to make amateurs improve. Okay. An amateur improving by 5% is really It might not even be noticeable except to the player. But if you can make a professional's game 2 or 3 or 4% better, that puts them ahead of a lot of people. And that's exactly what happened with these Prince rackets that he got out there. He started fiddling with it. I showed you some samples here. If the sweet spot is here on a Prince, look where it is on this one. Look where it is on this one. Nobody had ever done the math before. This is where his rackets took off in 19, where are we? Slide 222. There we go. Oh, yeah. People gave it names, of course. The snowshoe, the spaghetti strainer, the bionic banjo. 1978, Pam Shriver, 16 years old, reached the U.S. finals by beating Martina Navratilova using a Prince racket. She lost to Chris Ebert in the finals, but she was only 16 years old at the time. And this shows you again, there's some Prince balls. Prince makes lots of sporting equipment. He sold out and did good things. This time he got a lot more than $16 million when he sold out Prince. He sold his shares in 82 for $62 million. He was living in Baltimore by this time. He was on his third or fourth wife. I forget which. If you go to Vail, Colorado, there is the medical clinic there is his money. He actually donated the money for that clinic in Vail. This is the head theater in Baltimore. The Baltimore Center Stage Theater has a black box theater that he donated everything for. This can be torn down into a ballroom. This can be made into any theater configuration you want. And it's named for Howard Head because he's the one who gave the money for it. He is in the Inventors Hall of Fame. He is the patron saint of the average athlete because he made every average athlete's game better. And like I say, he's buried halfway down a hill that would be pretty good for skiing. Now we come, I've got to admit, you're not supposed to play favorites. Ernesta is my favorite. This is Amy Ernesta Drinker Bullet Bow Barlow. She's buried in the Drinker family plot. Oh, goodness. How did that happen? Buried in this Drinker family plot right here. There's conservatory. There is the Betts Mausoleum, and the Drinker plot is here beside a very set of steep steps. This may be my favorite plot in the cemetery. 8 of the people in this plot have their own Wikipedia page. And Amy is not one of them, or Ernesta is not one of them. This is a family portrait. This is her father. He was president of Lehigh University. This is her older brother, James. You've heard of a Drinker Reith Biddle. This is the Drinker for that. This is Philip Drinker. He invented the iron lung. This is Cecil Kent Drinker. He is also a physician. He investigated the radium girls in the 1920s. This is little sister Kitty Drinker. Kitty grew up to be, no, I'm sorry, this is Cecil here. I apologize. This is the brother who became a banker. I don't know anything about him. And then this is Kitty. Kitty came up to be best-selling author who won numerous prizes. Even though she was not trained as a historian, she won historical prizes. She was Book of the Month Club selection 4 times. Fascinating story. I've covered her in the book also. But this is the bewitching Ernesta, and I know your eye went to her just because this is her aunt, Cecilia Bow. Cecilia Bow was, of course, one of the premier portrait painters in the 19th century. Cecilia Bow knew exactly what she had with this niece. She had a subject that she could paint for the rest of her life. She started with a sketch. And this is when this girl is like 12 or 13 years old, and she's looking like this. But Aunt Bow, knew from the time that Cecilia was a baby.
Dr. Lex,
Ernesta, yes, ma'am.
Interrupt you for just a moment. We are currently looking at a slide that's a map. Is that the right one?
No.
Okay. Yep, we're looking at slide 126. I just heard you reference
I'm on 129. All right, let me come out of this. No, I don't want to keep the let's do share again. Let me bring it back up. What do you see now?
Ernesta, black and white family photo, map 126, 127, 126, 127.
Down 27. All right, there's the family portrait. Rats. Okay. So there's her brothers up here. There's Cecil. Cecil's the one with the radium girls. Philip's the one who invented the iron lung. Kitty is the one who wrote best-selling books. And there is the beautiful Ernesta there. That's the sketch that Aunt Bo made when she was about 12 or 13 years old. Aunt Bo started painting her when she was 2 years old. This is called Ernesta and Nurse. This was actually chosen as the favorite painting at a contest in the 1930s. But as you can see, she kept painting Ernesta as she got older. She never painted Kitty. Somebody once asked her, could you paint the other child? And she literally said, no, she's unpaintable. With a forehead like that, she'll write books and go to Bryn Mawr. Well, she was half right. She did go to Bryn Mawr, and she's instantly recognizable in any photo because of her high forehead. But I just thought that was funny that the one sister, she said, no, she's unpaintable. Ernesta was proposed to about 50 times before she stopped counting. Finally, she decided to marry this guy. This is Bill Bullitt. Billy Bullitt was a newsman at that time. She went to the Great War with him. She was actually in Germany during the Great War with her husband, who was reporting for newspapers back here. She married Billy because she said he was somebody she thought she could argue with. William Bullitt's grandfather, John Christian Bullitt, is the guy whose statue is outside of City Hall. He's the guy who wrote the city charter during the consolidation back in 1854. John Christian Bullitt, is buried at Laurel Hill East. He's by Richard Rush. In fact, I think they're next door neighbors. But Billy Bullitt is not. Billy Bullitt is, I think he's buried at Woodlands. Anyway, they were only married for a few years. They had one child who died shortly after birth. Never had any others. During the time in Germany, Ernesta kept a diary. And when William Bullitt was coming back, the German authorities took all of his notes. So he came back with no notes he could convert into a book, whereas they ignored her diary and she had written everything down. So this is available online. It's actually a fairly interesting read, what it would be like to be an American in Germany during World War I. While he was reporting, Billy Bullitt met this girl. You may recognize her. This is Louise Bryant. Louise Bryant was married to John Reed at this time. John Reed, of course, was a communist. He was a reporter. He died in Moscow. He's one of two Americans buried in the Kremlin. Big Bill Haywood, I think, is the other one, the labor organizer. And so this Louise Bryant is John Reed's widow. If you've seen the movie Reds, Warren Beatty plays John Reed and Diane Keaton plays Louise Bryant. This is who Billy took up with. He said that she was his niece as he traveled around with her. She, interestingly, died of a disease called adiposa dolorosa, which is known as Derkham's disease. The guy that it's named for, Francis Xavier Derkham, is buried at Laurel Hill West, about 100 yards from where Ernesta is buried. Aunt Bo kept painting her. As you can see, she grew up from a beautiful child. She grew up to be a beautiful woman. She moved to New York after the divorce. She moved into the same building as Aunt Bo, painted her again, painted her this time, and we're starting to see some photos of her. This painting, there is no color version of it available. There's the black and white photo. This was in Ernesta's collection, and somewhere along the way, Ernesta cut this up into two pieces. This part, maybe because she liked the shoes, or maybe because that's where Aunt Bo's signature was, but she cut this huge painting down and made this painting, and that's what she kept in her apartments. Now, she ended up with no training, becoming the interior designer for the River House. The River House is one of the most high-class living establishments in New York City right now. A typical condominium right now goes for about 17 or 18 million dollars. This is literally a river house, as you can see. People who lived here could park their yacht out in front of it. And she got to design the public spaces in the river house. During this period, she took up with Rockwell Kent. Rockwell Kent was one of the best known illustrators in the country. He was also a demon for women. He and Ernesta had a torrid affair. He wrote incredible love letters to her. They are in the collection of Ernesta's that's at Georgetown University. You can see here, copied from the original at Georgetown University. Oops, I don't have my marker anymore. She ended up marrying this guy, though. He lived in the building next door to Aunt Beau. His name is Samuel L.M. Barlow. Guess what? He has a Wikipedia page also, as did the last few people I showed you. They were a perfect match together. Samuel Barlow was an opera composer. They got married in 1928 at Aunt Beau's, and for the next several decades, they had Wednesday night salons in their apartment. They had a 3-story apartment. The top floor was the music room. The acoustics were perfect. You could go on Wednesday night. You might run into Leontine Price. Paul Robeson might be there. It might be the Juilliard String Quartet. Eventually, they ran out of money. It's what happened. There's a whole story behind that also. During World War II, she decided that she wanted to help the cause by doing a radio show that promoted women's work during wartime. And she was given the nickname Commando Mary, which is the exact 180-degree reverse of what you would call a woman who looks like that, Commando Mary. And she said at first it bothered her, but then when she found out that the farmers were naming their cows after her, she accepted it. She testified before Congress a couple of times. When they ran out of money, they moved back to Philadelphia, and they lived in Springfield Manor on Stanton Avenue for the last 10 years. That's where my father lived the last 6 years of his life also, many years after them, because she died in 1990. No, she died in 1981, and then Samuel died the next year, 1982. An absolutely fascinating woman. She deserves her own biography. She probably deserves her own movie, but she's chapter 25 in the book. I got one more to go. You ready? You still with me? We're going to do Anna Meister. Somebody say something?
Affirmed. We are here.
Okay, thank you. This is Miramitta. River section is over here. Here's Washington. Miramitta, I find her by locating this sarcophagus and walking over. It's actually here. It's the flat stone here. The rest of this plot is empty. By the way, sarcophagus, sarcoma. Like sarcoma is a soft tissue tumor, so sarco is flesh. Phagus, like esophagus, swallow or eat. So sarcophagus means flesh eater. You learned something. This is Miramitta. She was a seamstress from Switzerland. She came into the United States, born in 1855. She suffered from some sort of unknown nervous disease. I'm thinking it, here's the emergency physician in me talking. She probably had some form of partial complex seizures or temporal lobe epilepsy from what I can tell from her story. While she was sewing, she suddenly dropped her needles and threw the knitting away, their sewing away, and she said that God had spoken to her. The apocalypse would come soon, and it was going to start in Philadelphia, and you had to get yourself ready, and she knew how to get you ready. She was going to tell you how to get ready for the apocalypse that was coming to Philadelphia. So by 1857, she had more than 100 followers. Most of them were Swiss and German immigrants, mostly women. She would give weekly sermons and dress all in white. She called her flock, the Society of the Daughters of God. One of her followers was a guy who was a pretzel magnate from South Philadelphia. He bought her a row house on 11th Street. It was just south of Washington. They had sacred rituals in this room. This was the third floor. This was the altar. No mortal was allowed on this stand, and this was the throne of Miramita. She had a vision where she walked through heaven and hell. She was given the knowledge then that she was the third person of the Trinity. She was the Holy Ghost. She was Jesus' sister. And her hair grew long and it fell out and it curled and it made words on the floor. And it was her new name. It was Jehovah Elamar Miramita. Now, with this religion, she insisted on celibacy. You don't get a lot of young followers if you insist on celibacy. Just ask Father Divine and the Shakers how well they lasted with their vows of celibacy. Some of her followers, though, were incredibly devout and they were in near constant prayers. She would give them special diets, things of cabbage, coleslaw. Coleslaw was a big winner, dandelion tea. But there was a ban on coffee and there was a ban on tap water. You had to boil your water, even if it came out of the tap, even if it was city water out of the tap. On the other hand, wine was part of the religious service, so you were allowed to drink wine. Now, she died in 1884. She died at age 55. She's buried in a plot next to her sponsor, the pretzel man, Philip Becker. The apocalypse did not come in 1886. She had predicted. So the members started to drift away, but there were still a few diehards, no pun intended. And in 1905, this is 21 years after Miramita's death, there were still 3 people in the house, but only 2 of them were alive. Sister Julia Rudman had been dead for a few weeks when the neighbors just got tired of the smell and called the police. The coroner, who's buried at Laurel Hill West, forgotten his name, found a fly-covered, rotting corpse. Carolyn Lang, one of the living, insisted that Sister Julia was not dead. There were 2 other beds in the room. They were prepared. They'd been prepared for years. One of them was for the return of Miramita, and the third one was for Jesus Christ, whom they were expecting any day now. Philip Becker's son took over the house. He sold the property to a small chemical firm, to a couple of brothers called Wyeth, who were starting a chemical firm. And since they set up their chemistry lab in the house, the smell that was left over from the prior occupants really didn't bother them that much, I suppose. There was a big auction that was made. It made it into the paper. And all of that beautiful stuff was sold, and they got $800. Her throne went for $3. There's a lot more to this story. I don't have time to talk about it right now because her followers came back and tried to dig her up. But we're not going to go into that. You have to go on. You have to either listen to the podcast or go on a tour. They were doing things like sticking glass straws in the ground so she could breathe. Very strange group of people. Miramita's full story is in chapter 44. Okay, I've already got some book signings set up. Mostly Lower Merion, which is where I live, Gladwin Library, Ludington Library, Bala Cynwyd. But this Lower Merion is also where Laurel Hill West was. So these people were really excited to have a book presentation. I'm not going to do a book reading like you'd normally see at a signing. I'm going to do a presentation like this. I've got 10 women selected, and I'm going to do a presentation like this. We don't know when it's going to be at Laurel Hill yet because the gatehouse is not finished. And we want to have a reception in the gatehouse. So we'll have to wait for that. There's my contact information. If you want to get in touch with me, that's my email address. That's my website, which is sort of dying right now. Thank you for listening and watching. If you want more information on the podcast, just put your smartphone up there and capture that QR code. It'll take you right to the podcast. And I will leave that up there as we come out of full screen. But do we have any? There we go. Chat.
No questions in the chat.
No questions? Oh, come on.
No, we have a very quiet audience. I just want to say that I haven't gone on one of your tours in a while, and it's such a delight to be reintroduced to your storytelling. You are a wonderful storyteller, Dr.
Well,
Lex.
thank you.
So thank you for this. I was really glad that you included Marion. She's one of my favorite stories at the cemetery, and that is a really great documentary about her. Um, and oh, when you said something about Miramitta saying that the apocalypse would occur in Philadelphia, would start in Philadelphia, it kind of reminded me of Sun Ra, who I think called Philly Death's headquarters. Uh, and
Right.
David Lynch, who said it was the inspiration for all of his horror.
Well, I have something to add to both of those things. Number one, David Lynch, who died recently,
Yeah.
I assume went to Laurel Hill West Cemetery at one time because the Edwin Forrest plot is there for all the actors and actresses who died in the Edwin Forrest home who did not have a place to be buried. And if you go to the back of that stone, the number one name at the top is Laura Palmer.
No. Wait,
Yes,
I'm
Laura
confused.
Palmer.
This is fictional, like Rocky, like Adrian Balboa?
No,
Wait, who
no,
is?
no, no. Laura Palmer was an actress who died at the Edwin Forrest home,
Oh, I see, I see, I see. For
and
those
her name
listening
and
at
her name is
home,
on the tombstone.
that's the fictional name of the protagonist. No, I guess the invisible protagonist of
Yeah,
Twin Peaks.
of Twin Peaks. Yeah, and I
Wow,
wonder if he saw that and it just stuck with him.
that's incredible. He must have because he lived in Philadelphia. I mean, not for too
Yes,
long, for a
I
while
know,
in the
I know.
60s.
And then I can't share with you the full Sun Ra story, but he was my patient once in the emergency department.
No. Does
This
HIPAA,
was a long time ago. This was like 30 years ago.
how
And
long does HIPAA go?
what's that?
How long does HIPAA last?
HIPAA is 50 years.
Ah, so we'll ask you in 20.
Yeah, I'll be 97.
We'll ask you in 20. You'll be
All
given
right.
yours.
Anyway, I will tell you that when he checked in, he used his full name, El Sonia El Ra,
Uh-huh.
not Sonny Blunt, and birthplace, he put Saturn.
Yeah.
And I had to talk the admitting team out of doing a spinal tap on him because they said he's delusional. He thinks he's in Saturn and that his parents are in outer space. I said, no, listen, this is Sun Ra. Listen to me. So
He's
I,
an
I at least
artist.
saved him from a spinal tap. But there's more to that story, but I can't tell it.
That's wild. He's an artist, and artists are sometimes born on other planets.
If that didn't generate questions, I don't know what will. I still don't see any questions popping up though.
Would anyone like to pop a question in the chat for Dr. Lex? If not today, I'm sure you will catch him at a future in-person or virtual tour. I just want to say thank you again, Joe, for doing this.
Oh, you're very welcome. You're very well. If you can't tell, I like doing these things.
You're very yeah, you do. And your stories are just they have so much color and vivid detail to them. So it's really fun to see Laurel Hill through your eyes and your research.
And I'm probably one of the few people who can show 150 slides in 60 minutes or 70
It's
minutes.
very true. You really keep it going. It's efficient.
Okay. Well, thank you for listening. Stay safe, stay well, stay above ground, and I'll see you on a tour.
Thanks, everyone. Bye bye.